see on the screen the end result of what we're going to be working towards today. This may be a little longer tutorial than usual, but I can't see any sensible way of splitting this up. So we'll get straight into it. First thing we're going to do, and we need to recognize in this scene, is I'm taking a few liberties with scale, simply because I want to make use of the post-processing effect of glowing material. So we're just going to load a standard sphere. Let's get this into our viewport. There we go. I'm just going to change the aspect ratio of our viewport just so we can see what's going on more clearly. So we have a standard sphere. We're not going to worry about the atmosphere at the moment. We're just going to set up our planet initially. So I'm going to cheat. We're going to use a displaced material, and I'm going to use a material that I've set up previously for myself. I'll show you the settings as we go, so you can replicate it if you so desire. So I've loaded the displaced material. You can see the effect we have at the moment, but we're going to edit it a little bit. We're going to edit it for several reasons. We're going to look at the displacement and also give you an opportunity to see what I've done here, and I'm going to edit it slightly because we don't need any alpha information, so I'll delete that. And we also don't need this or this, so we'll just get rid of them for the moment because I want to attach that through to the terrain fractal so that our color scheme follows the terrain. Makes it a much more simple graph. You can see I've used a multiply by a constant, and we can see that that is in this particular section, which is in the math section, and multiply by a constant. Multiply by a constant simply because you can connect that through to the position, which is what we require. And then just a simple terrain fractal with a few details here and there. I'm going to reduce the scale of this because this was originally designed for use over a terrain. So you can see we end up with a much more interesting texture by reducing the wavelength of the texture. I just want to quickly go through and show you the bump setting, which is at about 0.24. Remember to tick displacement mapping when you're setting this up. But one of the things I really would like to do in this particular case is to look at the color map that I'm using. At the moment we have sandy, rocky, mountainous planet, but I want to get some green into there. So the first thing I'm going to do is to just tweak this so that we change its aspect slightly. And I want to add at this point, so I'm just clicking randomly at the moment anywhere in the color field, it doesn't matter. And I'm going to change that to a new tab, and I'm going to make it green because I want some greenery on our planet. Now you can see the greens coming in at very low level. So if we're going to put in a water sphere, that green would be covered. So by moving it to the right, we're changing its altitude. I don't really want that one, so I'm going to delete that. You can see now that the green is creeping up. I can make this more apparent just by moving the sliders. So I've got some green. At this moment, we don't really know whether that's exactly what we want. And I'm just going to change this last color to a white, just so we get some snow on the mountains. You can see a little bit poking through. I don't want it to be too much. I can increase it slightly. So that will do for the moment. So remember, this is a standard that I've set for myself. By all means, look at the node structure. We don't need that tab. That can be deleted. So we have a multiply, which can be found here in the math section. So it's multiplied by a constant. I've got a terrain fractal, which I've linked through to the color using a filter and a color map. We add filters simply because it increases our flexibility when we are further editing materials. So for the moment, that will do. So we have our planet. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to copy and paste that sphere. So we have a sphere on top of a sphere, identical materials, but I'm going to reset the material of our second sphere. And I'm also going to change some names while I'm here. I'll make that planet. Ooh, if I could spell, that would be a good thing. And then I'll change that to water. Okay, so you can see the grey sphere is beginning to poke through. It may want to be fractionally bigger for my purposes. A little bit more. Okay, so I'm beginning to see a little bit more water each time I just nudge up the scale by putting the cursor in the center of this, I don't know how you describe that, in the center of this thing. Okay, so we've got a good spread of water now. So we're going to edit that material. So we're going to right click and I'm going to load a default water material. I don't really need the transparency. I don't need to see the bottom of the sea. If this were a planet, the sea would be a kilometer deep, 2 kilometers deep. You wouldn't see the underlying ground. So I'm going to get rid of transparency altogether. The only reason I'm using this material is because I'm lazy and I don't want to build another bump map. Your material is entirely up to you. And I'm going to add a nice desaturated water color. Again, because we want it to be fairly dark. I need to look at the scale of this water, and in particular the scale of the bumps. It comes in by default set at 1.5, so I'll just reduce that very quickly down to 1. And I'll also look at the setting in the function editor. Remember that most of the materials that ship with Vue are designed to be used on vast landscapes. So we have to do some remedial work fairly quickly just to get things down to a size that we can handle. Okay, that's much better. I'm also going to look at its specularity because I may want to rotate things and change things, and I want to see some effect from the sun. So I'm just going to increase the brightness, and I'm going to just change the color of the highlights just to soften them down a wee bit. So that's our water layer added. Let's do a quick preview render and see what we've got. So as you can see, we have some quite tasty mountains going on. Scale-wise is totally a subjective issue. It's about what you want to achieve. We can reduce the amount of displacement to reduce the height of those mountains, but at the moment, for our purposes, it will do. So I'm going to copy and paste the water material sphere, and I'm going to change this now to a cloud layer. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to increase the scale of this sphere. We want the clouds to be above the ground. Let me just reset that material. Okay, so you can see at the moment, if you want, you can have the clouds below the top of the mountains, but for my purposes, I want the clouds to be above the mountains. Okay. I think we've got a little bit of poke through going on there, but I'm not worried. So I'm going to edit that material. What we're looking for now is to produce a layer of clouds. We can't really use a volumetric material. Obviously, we can't use a cloud material in a sphere. So we're going to adapt and change its alpha. So alpha deals with transparency. So we want to change the transparency of this layer. And what we're going to do is we're going to just tidy up as usual. And we're going to add, by right-clicking, a texture map. And we're going to use a projected texture map. So if I link that through to the alpha, okay, so nothing's going to happen because we haven't input an image. In the files, the standards that ship with Vue, we do have a planetary cloud map. So I'm going to double click that to apply it. And the first thing you'll see is that the clouds are transparent, but the spaces between the clouds are solid. So I'm going to invert that map. So white becomes black, black becomes white, and we end up with our clouds visible now. Okay, so we'll leave that as it is for the moment, and we'll do a quick test render to see how the clouds are interacting with our planet. Now, one of the problem is you can see the scale of the clouds is far too big. That's because I forgot to change this from world standard to object parametric. Now you can see already the effect in the preview window. Again, let's do a test render. So you can see now we've got the clouds at a much more sensible scale. They're wrapping around the sphere nicely. And we'll click OK. So last but by no means least, we want to talk about the haze. The haze surrounding the planet. We have a haze surrounding our planet at all times. It's water vapor, it's particulate matter, it's good old pollution. And we need to simulate that. So we're going to paste another sphere. Same sphere over and over again. All we're doing is changing the size of the sphere and the material of the sphere. So I'm going to reset that. And I know I want this haze layer to be slightly above the clouds. So everything is encompassed. And we'll go ahead and we'll edit that material. So planetary haze, when there is water involved, is generally a bluey kind of color. So we'll just edit the color and we'll make it blue. Again, this can be edited at a later date. So we've got a solid blue sphere. What we really want is to produce a ring around the planet, as it were. So again, we're going to look at the alpha production. Remember, alpha production deals with transparency, so what we're looking for is something which is going to produce this ring-like effect. Within view, we're going to look at the inputs, and we're going to look at the angle of incidence. So, input, angle of incidence. Obviously, nothing will change until we start doing some connecting, but before we connect, I need to add a filter. Adding filters, as I say, increases the flexibility of the material. We have options then to edit the material. So you can see immediately by connecting, we've got a semi-transparent blue sphere. And as soon as I connect it through to the angle of incidence, we end up with this effect. Okay, so it's the blue is denser around the outside, and we end up with a semi-transparent center. So we've added a filter, and we've added a filter for a purpose, because we're going to just change this slightly. I'm going to double click on the line to add an anchor point, and I'm going to add a second anchor point. So this second anchor point is going to control how much of the haze we actually see. So you can see we've got a very slim, thin line around the outside with some haziness in the middle. If we take this upper control point and move it, you can see how the blue starts creeping into the center, and you can see the effect on the preview. And if we just drag it down a bit further, you end up with just a very small hole. We want to be around, difficult to say at this point. We'll tweak this as we go. We can also see from the preview this blue may be a bit too intense, but again, I won't change the color until we've amended the atmosphere. So we'll click OK, go back, check everything is good, but one last setting that we need to look at. Remember, I talked about it being a glowing material. Remember, this is an effect which is applied after the render is completed. This does not appear within your scene. It's almost like it's been photoshopped in place. I don't want quite as much as we've got at the moment. I think about 3-4% should be good. What we're looking for is this glow to soften the edge of our outer atmosphere. So I'm going to leave it like this for the moment, because what we're going to do is we're going to amend our atmosphere. So we want this planet to be floating in space. There are a few things we need to change. For a space atmosphere, I generally find a volumetric atmosphere to be the best. We're going to change some settings. We don't want any fog. We don't want any haze. So we've got jet black. Just check the light setting for the overall skylight color, because Viewer has a tendency to change this for us. And I don't want it to be that kind of color. I just want it to be a slightly warm color. Okay, you can see how it's settled down. And of course, the one thing we need to get rid of is the ground. So we'll just delete that. So you can see already we've got a sphere floating in space. The reason it's glowing in the dark is because of our auto exposure, which we're going to get rid of. We'll do a preview, or not, as the case may be. Moving on, let's refresh that window. So we have an atmosphere. There are no stars. There is just a planet floating in space. So we'll go to the atmosphere editor again, and we'll look at the effects that we have within View. We can add stars. I don't like the lens flares, and I'm going to have some colored stars, and you'll see why when we drop a backdrop in. And I'm just going to increase the quantity. I don't want to increase the brightness at this stage because I don't know how bright I require it. So we'll just do a quick preview render. So we have some stars, we have a planet. Let's just move the sunlight a wee bit so we can see, because you can see at the moment it's slightly above the vertical. Horizontal. So I'll just rotate the sun round so we can illuminate more of our planet. And we'll do a quick test render. My gut feeling is that blue haze is too blue. It's a little bit in your face. So you can see the effect of the glowing material. It softens the edge. We'll click OK. And I like a little bit of lens glare in my images. It just softens it down a bit. So we'll go back and we'll change the name of this layer while we're editing it. Right click, edit material. That blue is far too blue. Let's desaturate it a little bit, make it paler. Now we can see a little bit better. It's maybe too desaturated or too pale. A little bit better. Okay. So I'm quite happy with that as it stands at the moment. Let's have a quick test render. I always find that test rendering is essential. Okay, that's looking quite convincing. So the last thing I want to look at is maybe making this backdrop a little bit more interesting. And the simple way to do that is if we select the camera and double click it, we get the camera options and we get the option to add a backdrop. So I'm going to use the backdrop and I'm going to add an image. Now, again, I've been quite lazy and I have chosen some images to test that I've just lifted straight from Google. Obviously, you have to be beware of copyright issues. If you want to use this for a commercial project, you really need to be asking for permission. If you're using it for a personal project, when you publish that project, please credit the website or the person whose image that you have used. So I'm just going to double click this one and you can see there's the image that we're going to be using. Now here by default we're overriding the atmosphere. I don't want to override the atmosphere. I want to see the stars I've put in plus the backdrop stars. So I'm going to just click override atmosphere so that we can see everything that we've got, and we'll click OK and we'll do a render. So you can see now the backdrop is in place. The backdrop doesn't accept shadows, so it's going to be fairly constant. Let's click OK. And I think it's time to do a slightly larger image. We'll render to screen. This is fine for my purposes, and we'll do a quick test render. So you can see that the backdrop is in place. It's quite nice. That blue, I don't know. It needs a little bit more tweaking. I also think, whilst I'm looking at this, there's not enough water visible. We're not making best use of that water. So it may be that we want to increase the size of the water sphere, which we can do momentarily. Okay, so the haze is in. You can see the clouds. I'm going to tweak the cloud layer as well because it's coming in a little bit dull. So I can do a couple of things here. I can take the clouds. It may be that you want to rotate the cloud sphere a little bit so that you can get a slightly different cloud aspect. We can also look at editing the material, check what color we're using. We're using bright white, but it may be you would like to increase its reaction to the diffuse lighting. The diffuse lighting is the sunlight, so by increasing this number, it reacts more. It illuminates a little bit more. I wouldn't tweak the luminosity because I really don't want the clouds to be showing on the dark side of the planet. Okay, so let's do a quick test. Remember, at this stage, test renders are essential. You can render small areas, you can render large areas. I like a full render because I just want to see exactly what's going on. So, and then we're going to look at this water in a second. I'm going to stop that because I've seen all I need to see. The clouds are much more visible. And we'll close that window when it finishes applying the lens glare. Okay. So the water, this is where it gets tricky because we've got spheres on top of spheres on top of spheres. So let's make the cloud layer and the haze layer invisible. So now we can see a little bit better. And I want to just increase that just a smidgen. Now, according to what I'm seeing, there should be more water. So I'm going to stop doing such a massive preview render because it takes too long. So we can see more water. My concern about the water at this stage is we're getting far too many highlights. That would seem to suggest to me that the bump is too much. So I'm going to reduce that down to about 0.2. Okay, do a quick test render again. So you can see we've achieved a little bit more water. Again, it's entirely up to you as an individual as to whether or not what you see works for you, but it's all subjective. I hope you found it useful. Please remember to check us out on social media and YouTube. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.